Versailles gleamed like the sun, yet that very brilliance burned millions of poor French souls, left in the shadows of a king who declared himself the center of the universe. That light was not the glow of dawn, nor the flame that sustains life. It was a harsh, blinding radiance, one that dazzled all of Europe, while at the same time veiling the cries and the groans that echoed across the fields of France. They called him the Sun King. He placed himself at the eternal center, a point around which every person, every ritual, every fragment of life was forced to revolve. Versailles, the grandest palace of its age, rose from the blood, sweat, and tears of his subjects. Its gilded walls and endless gardens were not monuments to a nation's prosperity, but a marble tomb erected for vanity and absolute power. And history leaves us with a question, lingering like an endless shadow. Can a dynasty truly shine with the brilliance of the sun if the price is an entire people consumed in darkness? 17th century France was not the gilded land we see in museum paintings, nor the dreamy nation bathed in Parisian sunsets as we imagine it today. It was a fractured realm, explosive yet fragile, a kingdom torn apart by war, hunger, and the greed of its nobility. When Louis XIV was born in 1638, he had no idea he was entering a world so unstable that the French throne itself wavered like a candle in the wind. They called him the child of a miracle, for his parents had waited more than 20 years for a son and heir. Yet this supposed gift from God would grow up in a country that often felt abandoned by God himself. In 1643, at only 4 years old, Louis was crowned king. A child who could not yet read, who barely understood the pain of losing his father, was suddenly wrapped in the heavy cloak of monarchy. In those early years, power rested not with him, but with his mother, Queen Anne of Austria, and her ambitious chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin, cunning and shrewd, yet also greedy and ruthless, became the true master of France throughout Louis's childhood. While the palace swirled with intrigue, the people outside lived in misery, and the distance between king and subjects grew ever wider. Then one day, the flame of rebellion ignited. The Fronde erupted while Louis was still a child, but the memories it left behind would scar him for life. The Fronde was no ordinary revolt. It was a direct challenge to the throne, the growl of nobles unwilling to surrender power to crown and clergy, and the cry of commoners crushed beneath the weight of endless taxes. For young Louis, the Fronde was fear turned into a living memory. He was forced to flee with his mother, pulled from his bed in the middle of the night, escaping mobs that laid siege to the palace. Imagine a boy of 5 or 6 watching soldiers and townsfolk storm the royal residence, hearing the crash of doors flung open, seeing torchlight flicker across furious faces. Born to be revered, Louis instead trembled behind velvet curtains, listening to the shouts of, "Down with Mazarin, down with the Queen," and sometimes hearing his own name spat out with hatred. In that moment, he learned a bitter truth. The throne was not untouchable. And if a king did not hold absolute power, someone else surely would. Those memories lingered in him like a wound that never healed. While other children grew up with games and laughter, Louis grew up with the roar of angry crowds, with the humiliation of fleeing through a kingdom where he was supposed to reign. Out of that pain grew a hidden obsession, a fear of chaos, a fear of losing power, a fear that the throne might collapse at any moment unless he seized it with both hands. And from that fear was born a desire for total control, a longing to make himself the immovable center of France, an eternal sun no one could eclipse. When the Fronde was finally crushed, Louis was 14. But within him had already formed a cold resolve. Never again would France fall into the hands of rebellious nobles. Never again would mobs force him to taste shame. Louis XIV, once the trembling boy behind the curtain, swore to himself that he would be the sole master of his kingdom. No parliament, no noble, no cleric would ever be allowed to challenge that role. From the soil of chaos, an absolute monarch was born. Fear was no longer something that drove him backward, but a fire that propelled him forward. Louis XIV learned to bury the insecurities of his childhood and mask them with pride. The world saw a confident young king, but inside, he was a man desperate to keep the past from haunting him again. And to do that, he had to build a throne not only strong, but so dazzling it could blind everyone who looked upon it. History is often ironic. The pain of a child can become the engine of an entire dynasty. Louis XIV, who once trembled before the crowd, turned all of France into his stage, where every gaze had to fall upon him. He understood that there was only one way to silence chaos: to become the sole authority defining what order meant. And from those childhood fears, the path to the Sun King was set. We like to think power is born of ambition, but in the case of Louis XIV, it was born of fear. The fear of losing everything became the will to control everything. And from those dark, trembling years under the shadow of the Fronde, the blazing light of an absolute sun began to rise. When Louis XIV came of age, he did not wish to rule like an ordinary king. He wanted to become the living definition of power itself, to make all of Europe understand that in France, nothing existed outside of him, nothing shone brighter than him. And to achieve that, Louis needed a symbol, an eternal image, so that whenever people thought of power, they would think of his name. That symbol was the sun. In Greek mythology, Apollo, the god of light, art, and harmony, was seen as the one who guided the universe. For Louis XIV, the sun was his own reflection, because the sun does not merely shine, it stands at the center, irreplaceable, towering over all, and everything must revolve around it. By casting himself as the sun, Louis sent out a message both cold and clear. Not the Pope, not the nobility, not the parliament, but he alone was the center of the political universe. In ceremony and painting, in music and ballet, Louis appeared as the single star in the heavens. When he entered, the court stood still. When he sat, the court dared to breathe again. Light became the language of power, and Louis mastered it, using it to dim everything that might cast a shadow over him. But such a symbol demanded a stage grand enough to sustain it, a place where his light could shine so brilliantly that all else faded away. Versailles became that stage. Once, it had been nothing more than his father's modest hunting lodge, sitting in the marshlands, far from Paris. Under Louis XIV's hand, it was transformed into the most magnificent palace in Europe, a masterpiece not only of stone and timber, but of the sheer will of a king determined to turn power into something visible, tangible, unshakable. Versailles was never just a building. It was a proclamation, a living monument to a regime that wanted to declare, the king is everything, and all else is but shadow. Within its gilded walls, its endless halls where one could lose their way, its gardens trimmed to the last leaf, Versailles was less a residence than a political weapon. Louis did not build Versailles to rest, he built it to dominate. The nobility, summoned there, believed they were basking in glory, yet in truth, they had stepped into a golden cage. Inside that cage, they feasted at glittering banquets, danced at dazzling balls, but they were also bound to live under the king's gaze, dependent on his favor, drained of the energy or freedom to plot against the throne. Versailles was the sweetest trap in French history, a machine that slowly ground down aristocratic power beneath the weight of ritual and luxury. Louis XIV understood the force of theater. Versailles was a colossal stage, and he was its sole leading actor. Each morning, his awakening became a sacred rite, nobles competing for the honor of dressing him, presenting water, even standing near him, a privilege that could elevate an entire family's status. By turning even the smallest acts of daily life into ceremony, Louis created a world where everything revolved around him. And when every eye was fixed upon him, no one had the strength to look beyond. Yet while Versailles blazed with light, France beyond its gates was shrouded in shadow. As crystal chandeliers lit the banquets in the Hall of Mirrors, peasants in remote villages burned their last stick of wood to survive the winter. While the gardens of Versailles sparkled with fountains that never ceased to flow, the fields dried under the sweat and blood of the poor, drained by the taxes that fed the palace. Versailles was a glittering mirage, hiding the truth that France was not nearly as wealthy as it appeared, that the sun's light did not shine upon the soil, but only reflected off gilded walls. Every stone, every statue, every manicured tree in Versailles was paid for with hardship. Thousands of workers, craftsmen, peasants perished in its making. The calloused hands and bent backs of the many built a palace that only a privileged few would ever enter. In the perfection of Versailles lay the tragedy of a people exhausted to fuel a royal dream. And there, contradiction became the essence of Louis XIV's age. Inside the palace, music, theater, and the arts flourished with unmatched brilliance, symbols of beauty and grandeur. Outside, hunger, plague, and crushing taxes fell upon those who would never glimpse Versailles' light. One world was gold and marble, the other mud and misery, yet both coexisted in a France that Louis sought to make the heart of Europe. What made Versailles terrifying was not only its splendor, but the emptiness behind it. It was a fortress of appearances, built to conceal, to force Europe to look up and believe France a mighty power, while in truth, decay had already begun at its roots. Versailles was deception carved in marble, and Louis XIV was the director of this grand illusion. People still praise Versailles as an architectural wonder, but few speak of it as a monument to the chasm between king and people. Every gilded tile, every painted ceiling was like a vast curtain hiding the cries of peasants. And while music resounded in Versailles' halls on the muddy roads beyond, the cries of hungry children dissolved into darkness. Louis XIV succeeded in creating an immortal symbol. To this day, when we think of 17th century France, we think of Versailles, of the Sun King, of a reign drenched in splendor and light. But behind the brilliance lay a stark truth. Versailles was not proof of shared prosperity, but of monopolized power and of indifference to the suffering of the many. The sun that Louis XIV raised was not a gentle warmth, but a burning fire. It blinded those dazzled by glory, it scorched the lands of the poor, and it left in history a haunting question. Is light still light if it shines only upon a palace, while leaving an entire people in darkness? There is a phrase forever tied to Louis XIV. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. Historians still debate whether he ever spoke those exact words, but no one can deny that his life and reign embodied them completely. If Versailles was the palace of stone, then this phrase was its foundation. The idea that placed Louis himself at the very center of politics, culture, and even religion. As a child, Louis had seen just how fragile royal authority could be, scarred by the chaos of the Fronde rebellions. He swore never to let power slip from his hands again. So when he came of age, he did not simply rule, he redefined what kingship meant. For Louis, France was not something separate from him. It was an extension of his own being. The kingdom, the court, the arts, the church, the army, everything became a mirror reflecting the image of the Sun King. Before him, French monarchs shared power with nobles, with parliaments, with the church. After him, they revolved around him like planets around the sun. He stripped parliaments of real authority, reduced the nobility to ornamental courtiers trapped at Versailles, dependent on royal favor. Even the church was bent to his will, transformed from a potential rival into a tool of the throne. In 17th century France, nothing existed outside the circle of light he cast. In politics, he turned the royal court into the sole heart of power. Every decision, large or small, passed through his hands. In the arts, he was not just a patron, but a director, molding culture into a vast propaganda machine to glorify himself. Molière's comedies, Lully's music, the paintings and monuments, all radiated from him, all designed to celebrate the king. Art ceased to be an expression of freedom. It became a polished mirror held up to reflect one man's grandeur. Religion, too, was brought under control. Louis was a devout Catholic, but faith to him was not merely communion with God, it was politics. Catholicism became the unifying creed of the realm, while Protestants were driven out. By revoking the Edict of Nantes, he stripped the Huguenots of their protections, forcing hundreds of thousands into exile. For Louis, no rival light, spiritual or earthly, was allowed to shine beside his own. But absolute power is never sustained by ritual or art alone. It must be proven on the battlefield. Louis XIV believed a great king could not rule in peace alone. He must inspire fear and awe across Europe. Thus his reign became inseparable from war. From his youth, he plunged into campaigns, and throughout his life, he was never far from the drums of battle. There were triumphs. France emerged as the continent's most formidable military power. French armies, disciplined and well-equipped, carried the Sun King's banners across Europe. He expanded borders, built mighty fortresses, and turned war into a kind of spectacle. In those years, Louis seemed less a mortal king than Apollo himself, god of the sun and an invincible warrior. But victories came at a heavy price. Every advance was paid for in blood, peasants conscripted, families broken, taxes piled higher with each campaign. Behind the grand celebrations in Versailles' glittering halls lay the silent fields of the dead, the villages drained of their men. And not every war ended in glory. Many dragged on, draining treasure, lives, and patience, only to end in stalemate or defeat. The treasury, already bled dry by Versailles, collapsed under the burden of endless campaigns. The people bore the weight in taxes, while crops rotted in abandoned fields and famine stalked the land. As the king toasted hollow victories, his subjects struggled merely to survive. For Louis, war was not just defense, it was a stage for his own power. He wanted Europe to acknowledge France, and by extension himself, as the center of all authority. But maintaining that illusion drove his people into misery. The neat figures in tax ledgers, the reports of famine, the cries from the countryside, all were drowned out by the trumpets of his armies and the glow of Versailles. Looking back, the paradox is clear. Louis XIV succeeded in making France the cultural and political center of Europe, yet the cost was the exhaustion of his nation. He won battles, yet sowed resentment and suffering. He became the sun, but in doing so, he scorched the very earth that sustained him. His absolute power was more than political or military. It was the power to define reality itself. He turned art into propaganda, faith into policy, war into theater. And in this grand performance, the French people were not participants but pawns, tax entries, nameless corpses on forgotten fields. Perhaps the most chilling part of his reign was not his despotism, but his success in making it all seem normal. People accepted that the king was the state, that war was inevitable, that art existed only to praise power. In that acceptance, a whole nation became a shadow, an audience for a single star's performance. Louis XIV lived true to his declaration, "I am the state." But history, in its ruthless way, asks the lingering question, how long can a state endure when it is bound to one man alone, when its light must be fed by the blood and darkness of millions? In the paintings of Louis XIV's reign, we usually see a king draped in golden robes, standing tall within the dazzling halls of Versailles. But few dare to look beyond the frame, where millions of men and women bend their backs in the fields, carrying the weight of taxes on their shoulders, their stomachs as hollow as empty clay jars. They were the nameless shadows, the true foundation of 17th century France. And bitterly enough, they were the ones who paid the heaviest price for the Sun King's glory. For peasants of the time, work did not simply mean feeding their families. It meant feeding Versailles itself. Taxes piled upon taxes, land taxes, salt taxes, grain taxes, and endless petty fines dreamed up by officials determined to wring every last coin from the people. Each autumn, as soon as the wheat was harvested, the tax collectors would arrive with ledgers and soldiers, ready to seize whatever they pleased. The peasants were left with a meager share, barely enough to survive the winter, while the bulk of their crop was carted off to Paris, to Versailles, to be turned into the fine white bread that graced the banquet tables of the nobility. Some families faced the cruelest of choices: keep back grain as seed for the next season, and risk fines, confiscation, even beatings, or surrender everything and starve with at least the comfort of avoiding prison. It was a trap with no escape, a cycle that bound millions into a form of slavery on the very soil their ancestors had tilled for generations. When winter came, the contrast between Versailles and the rest of France grew unbearable. Inside the Hall of Mirrors, crystal chandeliers glowed over endless tables of venison, wine, and delicate pastries. Lully's music filled the air, mingling with aristocratic laughter beneath the suffocating weight of luxury. Just outside the palace gates, bodies huddled in the frost. Peasants, beggars, abandoned children, they died quietly at the threshold of Versailles, hoping for a scrap of discarded bread. Those who survived lingered as ghostly figures along the palace walls, never allowed to glimpse the candlelight within. Records from bad harvest years describe people chewing bark, weeds, even clay just to stave off hunger. Death came not by sword, but slowly, through starvation, cold, and despair. Meanwhile, a single frown from Louis XIV over a dish that failed to please his palate could send a legion of cooks rushing to prepare another feast. On one side, nameless thousands perished. On the other, a king's overfed stomach demanded perfection. History rarely drips with irony so sharp. Louis XIV liked to imagine himself as the son of France, yet for the poor, his light never warmed them. It only scorched their soil with endless wars, withered their harvests, and broke their backs under the burden of taxation. The peasants sustained their son with blood and only to be repaid with darkness and the cold of poverty. Versailles blazed like midday, while the rest of France was plunged into a night without dawn. The injustice was not only economic, but also an assault on dignity. In the eyes of the court, commoners were nothing more than entries in a tax ledger, lines in an official report. Human beings with dreams, with loves, with fears, flattened into revenue streams to nourish a dynasty. If a child died in a winter of famine, it was not mourned as tragedy, but noted as proof that the peasants had failed to pay enough. That invisibility, that erasure, cut deeper than death itself. And in that silence of the poor, Versailles shone even brighter. The palace was a colossal mirror reflecting the Sun King's brilliance, polished with the sweat of millions. Versailles was not merely a building, it was a chasm that swallowed an entire people. For every wall raised, a peasant's hut crumbled. For every banquet served, a family starved. From centuries away, France in that era looks like a stage split into two scenes. On the main stage, Versailles, glittering, resplendent, radiant, with Louis XIV playing the role of the sun. Behind the curtains, in the shadows, millions of peasants shivering, exhausted, cast as nameless extras no one would remember. The play went on year after year, and the tragedy was that no spectator had the power to change the script. Perhaps this was the greatest tragedy of Louis XIV's reign. He succeeded in making all of Europe gaze in awe at Versailles, in turning his power into legend, but he also succeeded in driving his own people into utter darkness. The French nourished a radiant sun, only to be burned alive under its heat. That was no accident of history. It was a deliberate choice. For Louis XIV, a king needed light, and the shadows, those were for the common folk to bear. And if you listen closely to the whispers of history, you might hear a bitter question. What is the meaning of light if it shines only on a palace while darkness covers an entire nation? Every sun must set. For Louis XIV, even the light that once seemed eternal began to fade in the twilight of his life. He had ascended the throne as a teenager, and by the time he closed his eyes for the last time, he had worn the crown for more than 70 years, a staggering length for any reign. But as the shadows of his rule grew longer, they cast over France a wariness and exhaustion that no brilliance could disguise. With age pressing down, Louis XIV was no longer the proud young king who once danced through the glittering halls of Versailles. He had become an ailing old man, his body consumed by disease, his foot rotting from gangrene, forced to drag himself slowly through the cold, endless corridors of his palace. And as his body decayed, so too did the kingdom, worn down by endless wars that seemed to devour everything in their path. The War of the Spanish Succession, stretching on for over a decade, was the final blow. It drained a treasury that had already been emptied long before, drowned the countryside in blood and famine, and broke the last strength of peasants who had survived too much already. Victory? If one dared call it that, it was a hollow one. France retained its honor, but lost its vitality. The king's glory had been bought at the cost of a nation on the brink of collapse. In those final days, Louis XIV still wore the mask of majesty, but behind it he knew his light was dimming. To his heir he confessed, "I have loved war too much. Do not follow me in this." It was both an admission and a regret, but it came far too late. No words could bring back the harvests lost, the lives extinguished, or the faith burned away in decades of relentless rule. For ordinary people, the sunset of the Sun King was not a tragedy. It was a release. When Louis breathed his last in September 1715, his funeral was a grand spectacle. Endless ceremony, trumpets blaring, a coffin borne through rivers of candlelight. The court mourned, the nobles bowed their heads, Versailles drowned in black. Yet outside, in the weary villages of France, perhaps there were sighs of relief. They did not weep for a king who had drained them dry. They felt instead as if a fever that had raged for 70 years had finally broken. His death, for many, was not a loss, but the faint spark of a new hope, that if the sun had set, perhaps the darkness would finally soften. The funeral of Louis XIV was, in its essence, a paradox. On the surface, it was the pinnacle of reverence for an absolute monarch. But beneath, it revealed the staggering gulf between ruler and ruled. Versailles still stood, a wonder of the world, but also a merciless monument, a colossal gravestone carved with the inequality between a palace and a nation. One could marvel at its beauty, yet never forget that every brick had been laid with sweat and tears, every feast lit by the silent deaths of those beyond its gilded walls. There is a strange irony in how history works. Louis XIV spent his life trying to fuse his own being with that of France, to become the sun whose light touched every corner of the land. Yet when he died, France did not die with him. Versailles did not crumble, the nation did not vanish. Instead, it was he who disappeared, leaving France to endure, scarred and weary but alive, carrying forward both wounds and lessons. The sun he left behind was not one of light, but of gathering shadows, shadows that would stretch on until revolution erupted nearly a century later. In his last days, gazing out over the gardens of Versailles, Louis could not have imagined that the monument he saw as the crowning glory of his reign would one day stand as a symbol of callous extravagance, a symbol the French people would come to loathe. He believed his light eternal, but history delights in mockery, turning eternity into an instant, the sun into nothing more than memory. The sunset of Louis XIV was more than the death of a man. It was the death of an idea. The idea that a single king could be the center of the universe, that the brilliance of one life could substitute for the light of an entire people. And when that idea collapsed, it left behind a void that later generations would struggle to fill. Through reform, through revolt, through blood, and through revolution. Louis XIV had lived like the sun, dazzling Europe, commanding both admiration and fear. But he died as any man dies, his body rotting away, his people sighing in exhaustion, and history watching with a cold, unblinking eye. And if there is one lesson to be drawn from that twilight, it is this: no sun rules the sky forever. For when its light shines only for one, it inevitably becomes the fire that consumes itself. The legacy of Louis XIV is like a cracked mirror, reflecting both brilliance and darkness at once. In it, we see a France dazzling in culture, art, and architecture, a France that the whole of Europe could only look up to. But we also see a France drained by endless wars, broken by famine, and weighed down by injustice. The name Sun King is both a symbol of glory and a curse that time itself has never erased. On one side, he left behind Versailles, a monument so grand that it still astonishes the modern eye. Its endless gardens, glittering halls, and gilded ceilings stand as proof of what human creativity can achieve when all resources are funneled into a single vision. Versailles made France the beating heart of fashion, art, opera, and refinement, the model all of Europe sought to imitate. It was the age of grandeur, when France was more than a nation. It was an ideal. Yet on the other side, Versailles was also a sentence. It was the cold stone wall that cut king from people, the mirror reflecting the luxury of the few and the misery of the many. It testified to the cruel paradox of a nation that appeared magnificent to the world, yet was rotting within. Every column of Versailles rose on the ruins of a peasant's home. Every glowing ball inside the palace meant another winter where millions languished in the dark. If Versailles was eternal, then so too was the injustice it came to symbolize in memory. Louis XIV's legacy was also written in war. He expanded his frontiers, elevated France's status, and spread the name Bourbon across Europe. But he also left behind a country exhausted, a people too weary to believe in glory, a generation carrying nothing but fatigue. Beneath the light of victory, the shadow of loss always lingered. History, in its cruel balance, weighed the brightness against the darkness, and the result was nothing more than a bleak shade of gray. Perhaps the greatest thing Louis XIV left was not Versailles, nor even his conquests, but an unsettling question. Can a nation survive when its destiny is entrusted to a single man? He lived convinced that he was France itself, that the state is me, that nothing existed outside his light. But when he died, France did not vanish. It endured, stumbling forward into crisis, into suffering, and down the long road to revolution. That endurance was the strongest rejection of his dream of being one with his people. If he was the Sun King, history reminds us that the sun does not only illuminate, it burns. It sustains life, but it can also scorch the harvest when it blazes too fiercely. So it was with Louis XIV. He lit up France in a moment of brilliance, but the price was a nation drained to its core. And therein lies the bitter irony. It was the French themselves who unknowingly fueled the very light that blinded them. Yet history is not only condemnation, it is also a mirror. To walk today through the halls of Versailles, to gaze at the gilded ceilings that catch the sunlight, is to see more than architecture. It is to see a lesson in absolute power, in the dangers of severing ruler from people, in the terrible price when one man places himself at the center of the universe. Versailles is not merely a site for admiration. It is a warning about the fragility of light and the persistence of shadow. The legacy of Louis XIV is therefore both radiant and tragic. It cannot be forgotten, for it embodies an eternal paradox. Power can create wonders, but it can also destroy a nation. And perhaps it is this paradox that is the true surviving light of the Sun King. Not a light to worship, but a light to guide those who follow. Louis XIV lived like a giant star, burning with brilliance, consuming everything around him. But like every star, he too collapsed, leaving behind a black hole that swallowed memory and awaited history's judgment. And in that judgment, no one asks how beautiful Versailles was, nor how splendid his reign appeared. They ask instead, how many lives were lost? How many generations were consumed by darkness, just so that one star could flare for a fleeting moment? For in the end, light is never eternal. Only the questions it leaves behind endure. And when it comes to Louis XIV, the question still echoes. Was he the sun that lit France, or the fire that consumed it?